Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event, Colombia at Home, Prospects for U.S.-China Relations in the Biden Era. My name is Eugenia Lean. I am a professor of history in the East Asian Languages and Cultures Department at Columbia University, and I'm also the director of the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. Today, I will be serving as a moderator for a wonderful panel that I hope you will all enjoy. Given the current climate of tense relationships between China and the US, we thought that this would be a very timely panel to examine how US-China relations will evolve with President Biden now at the helm of the United States. We hope too that the panel will address as we leave the COVID era, hopefully, that it will also address sort of the impact of COVID and now post-COVID on these particular relationships. So we have an esteemed panel, array of professors on this panel. And I would like to spend some time just quickly introducing them. Before I do, I also want to just mention that the program itself is co-sponsored by the CAA Global Clubs, and I wanted to thank them for initiating the panel, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute as well, and the Columbia Harvard China and the World Program. Our panelists include the following. Tom Christensen is the Professor of Public and International Affairs and the Director of the China and the World Program at Columbia University. His research and teaching focus on China's foreign relations, the international relations of East Asia, and international security. His most recent book is The China Challenge, Shaping the Choices of a Rising Power. Qin Gao is a professor of social policy and social work. She's the founding director of Columbia University's China Center for Social Policy. Her research examines the changing nature of the Chinese welfare system, its impact on poverty and inequality, China's social protection for rural to urban migrants in China and in Asian American immigrants. Her recent book is Welfare, Work, and Poverty, Social Assistance in China. Xiaobo is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of Political Science at Barnard College. He is the founding director of Columbia Global Centers in Beijing. His research interests include Chinese politics, US-China relations, politics of economic development, corruption and good governance, and government-business relations. He's currently working on a book manuscript, From Player to Referee, The Rise of a Regulatory State in China. Our fourth speaker is Andrew Nathan, class of 1919 professor of political science at Columbia University. His research interests include Chinese politics, foreign policy, the comparative study of political participation in political culture, and human rights. He is engaged in long-term research and writing on Chinese foreign policy and sources of political legitimacy in Asia. And finally, but certainly not least, Professor Benjamin Liebman. He is the Robert L. Lieff Professor of Law at the Columbia Law School and director of the Hongyan Chang Center for the Chinese Legal Studies. Professor Liebman studies Chinese court judgments, the roles of artificial intelligence and big data in the Chinese legal system. He studies Chinese tort law, Chinese criminal procedure, and the evolution of China's courts. So we have an impressive array of experts who will be speaking to the topic at hand. I will now welcome our first speaker, Professor Thomas Christensen.
Thanks a lot, Eugenia. I wanted to talk about US policy in the Biden administration, how it's likely to play out in US-China relations. At the start, I'll just say that a lot of the economic tensions, security concerns about Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea with Japan, and humanitarian concerns related to Xinjiang and Hong Kong democracy suppression are going to last into the current administration. They're not purely a function of the Trump administration, but I think some of the strategies will be different. Some of the good news is that the people involved in policymaking are highly experienced, people like Kurt Campbell, Laura Rosenberger, Dan Crittenbrink. The latter two I worked with at the State Department when I was in the government. They're highly talented people. I think their strategy will be a competitive strategy with China that will continue, but it'll be a different approach that places more emphasis on emphasizing the US's greatest advantage in a competition with China, which is alliances and partners. The United States will try to approach China on economic issues, on humanitarian issues, and on security issues, shoulder to shoulder with its allies and partners. And to do that, they need to rebuild those relationships, many of which were damaged during the Trump administration because of pressure on our allies over trade and pressure on our allies over burden sharing within the alliance system. So that seems like a good approach, and it should be relatively successful early on, repairing those relationships. A problem that I see is that part of an alliance-based strategy towards China requires an economic strategy towards East Asia. And I'm not clear that the United States as a corporate whole or the Biden administration is really ready to embrace the kind of multilateral trade agreements that would strengthen the US position in the region. There is the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States unilaterally pulled out of in the Trump administration. There is the RCEP, which is the regional agreement that was signed last year by 40 countries. And the problem that I see here is the Biden administration does not seem particularly enamored with multilateral economic diplomacy. It seems relatively protectionist, and that reflects a relatively protectionist turn in American domestic politics more generally. And I think it's going to be hard to have an alliance-based strategy toward China without an economic component. And we'll see how that plays out over time. There's also a need for cooperation, and I think the Biden administration recognizes this more than the Trump administration. We live in a globalized world. Despite US protectionism in the economic sphere, we can't handle a whole range of global issues without China's buy-in and China's participation. That includes climate change, most obviously, dealing with the pandemic, both directly and indirectly in the financial area around the world. Also, nuclear proliferation. Everyone knows that China is the biggest partner of North Korea, a proliferator, but a lot of people don't realize that China is by far the biggest economic partner of Iran. So those issues are going to be pressing, and you simply can't leave China out of any kind of approach to those areas when China has such a big footprint. So how the Biden administration will deal with those issues is going to be an interesting thing to watch. And one of the hopeful signs is that the Biden administration seems more comfortable with multilateralism than the Trump administration, which tried to handle problems bilaterally. This is useful because the domestic environment in the United States toward China is so hostile that it's difficult to cooperate with China bilaterally on the issues that I listed. It should be easier to cooperate with China in large groupings, multilateral settings. It'll have less of a domestic backlash if the United States pursues cooperation with China through the WHO, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, the WTO, the IMF, World Bank, the P5+1 on Iran nuclear negotiations, and maybe even the six-party talks again, which have been dormant for a long time on North Korea. So that embracing of multilateralism is a big advantage of the Biden administration. And then there's one last thing I want to mention before I sign off, and that is that we have a kind of a train wreck heading in US-China relations in early 2022, and that is the Winter Olympics that Beijing is hosting. Because of the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, a lot of countries are pressuring China on human rights issues right now, not just the United States. And the fact that the US has labeled what's happening in Xinjiang a genocide will make it very difficult to defend the idea that a US team should attend the Olympics, and that might be true in other countries. The backlash in China to a boycott of the Olympics will be very strong because of the history of Chinese nationalism and the notion that China's been bullied through history. So I see this as a real problem in the future. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I don't really see a lot of I see a lot of potential problems in the bilateral relationship that will flow from domestic pressure on the US government and on the US Olympic Committee regarding the Olympics. And I'll turn it over back to Eugenia. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tom. Our next speaker is Professor Qin Gao Tin.
Thank you so much, Eugenia, and thank you all for joining this discussion today. As a proud alum myself, I'm happy to reunite with my peer alums from around the world, especially from Asia. So I want to shift the discussion a bit to highlight 3 areas where I think the US and China should work together, both as collaborators and competitors in the years ahead. The first area is anti-poverty economic and social policy. The second area is public health. And the third area is education. I'll start from the anti-poverty policy area. So last year, toward the end of the year, China proudly declared winning the war of poverty. In fact, eradicating rural extreme poverty. It was on November 23rd, the announcement was made. It's a remarkable achievement, very proud to own this achievement by the current Chinese administration. But I think they also acknowledge poverty is not entirely gone. Poverty exists in other relative or dynamic forms, and there are different pockets of people in the society that still face more challenges than others. On the other hand, at the same time, the Biden administration just passed this 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, which is probably the most ambitious, most sweeping anti-poverty agenda since both the New Deal and the war on poverty in the US. So that's very promising. And the Biden administration especially has child poverty as a focus. So they are going to pursue child allowances, child tax credit, and also support parents to work by launching early childhood care centers. So those are amazing. And there I see the 2 countries are already learning from each other. For example, the Biden administration is pursuing infrastructure investment, which is a lesson from the New Deal and the war on poverty eras in the US, but also a lesson from China's recent successes in this regard. China is also now pursuing a lot of rural village early childhood care centers. And that is actually a lesson from the US's Head Start programs launched in the 1960s. So I think the 2 countries are looking at each other to see who can do this faster and better and in what ways. So I think that's an area where there should be some dialogue and joint efforts, both as competitors, but also as collaborators. The second area I want to touch upon is public health. Honestly, I think COVID is a missed opportunity for these 2 countries to work together. Can we all imagine what if the 2 countries work together to deal with the pandemic? I think the world would be at a different place. So I think that should be a lesson learned by everyone, the leaders of these 2 countries. I think we see promising signs in that regard, but I think we should also realize it's not easy, and a concerted effort should be made. In the US, Biden was in the Obama administration when Ebola outbreak happened. And I think that handling was much more successful than dealing with COVID. So lessons there for sure. The other major consequence of the COVID pandemic is the global mental health crisis. I think we are all feeling it. Adults, children, adolescents, everybody is under so much pressure, anxiety, the lack of control about the future, so many uncertainties. There, I see a greater need for the 2 countries to work together to deal with and provide support and interventions that are effective to support our 2 populations. And jointly, as Chinese American who now live in the US, but also have to communicate and deal with the health consequences for my family in China, I think we face this shared challenge, and that can be only dealt with in collaboration. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about education. I think today all our panelists and many in the audience are beneficiaries of collaboration exchange in the education area, especially in higher education, but maybe in elementary, middle school education as well, and some doing postdocs and further research. I think to pursue a future that's good for everyone, we need the future leaders that can benefit from this continued exchange and collaboration, and from the education systems that suit the people who decide what's the best for them. So I would urge the two countries to continue that tradition and not let the artificial barriers stop us from working together, and really to promote the human potential from both countries and from around the world. I will stop there and look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chin. For our third panelist, Xiaobo Liu will take the helm and give us a 5 to 6 minute presentation on his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. Thank you, colleagues and alumni around the world. It's a great honor to talk to you this way, although I'd love to, I would have loved to see you in, face to face, but in the pandemic, that's the best way to reach out to you. So as Tom and Chin have remarked, that this U.S.-China relations is in a rather difficult time, but so everyone is curious what Biden administration will do next in terms of this relationship. It seems to me, as observer of this relationship for many years, that the principal strategy of Biden administration regarding this relationship have emerged as what I would call 3C+. I think Tom has alluded to it. That is competition, cooperation, and counter. That's the 3C. Competition. Competition, obviously, that's a term being used quite often. Cooperation, obviously, has been there for a long time in this relationship, but also counter. That is, in areas where, when it comes to human rights violations and other issues that principal issues that U.S. obviously will push back. Now, the plus, another C, or one could say the fourth C, is with company. So that makes the difference between Biden administration and its predecessors, the Trump administration. That is, to do this not alone, rather as a group or with allies. Because as Tom alluded to, and I completely agree, that this will also lessen the kind of domestic burden or domestic pressure that Biden administration faces right now. And so I think in the U.S.-China relations, one of the key factors, which I will focus my next couple of minutes on, is what I call the people's factor, or the public opinion, the domestic pressure, what Tom Christensen alluded to. And if I may, I would like to share the screen with you. Give you a couple of, show you a couple of slides here. So this is the most, this is a survey, Pew Research survey done last October. And what this is interesting is that you can see that some of the major powers in the world, when they ask people of these countries what they think of China. So the blue line is the positive. So please take a look at a couple of countries. One is Australia. So Australia, the changes the most striking is Australia's public opinion on China. This is the favorable, unfavorable opinion. And you also can see this is where the United States. So US, even though it's not as bad as in Australia currently, it is it has to be the worst public opinion, I guess the worst public opinion regarding China in the last 40 years. So this is 73% of American public regard China more negatively. And that even, you see, if you also compare with Japan, here's Japan, where Japan, interestingly, even though it's pretty, the negative opinion is high, but it hasn't changed that much. It actually was down before, and this is back. And Italy obviously has the more, this is the public opinion. You can see that, of course, different countries, the public opinion obviously has changed, worsened in the last year also with the pandemic going on. Now, this is a more recent survey by Pew in February, February, and this is asked specifically what kind of issues that people's concern and how they view. What's interesting is even though some of the issues really has not changed that much, but US public opinion has worsened in 1 year. So it's interesting how, you know, cyber attack, for example, that hasn't really, we haven't really in the last year or so, there hasn't been much of that report of cyber attack from China yet. That has risen 7%. China's policy on human rights, that's not a surprise. Lost jobs to China, growing military power. So almost in every single issue area, except Taiwan, that has worsened even in 1 year. Now, this is also very interesting. Who are the people? How people, when they say, okay, the domestic pressure, where did that come from? So also this, the survey asks people distinguish between 3 different kind of sort of a China status or a view of China. One is partner, obviously, it's very few people. And then the other distinction, which I think Pew was the first time to separate the two, which is in line with this Biden administration's kind of view of China in the future as competitor or enemy, right? So either the competition or counter, if you will. And that also, very interestingly, the conservative Republicans obviously has the highest take on China as enemy, whereas in relative terms, the others mostly regard China as competitor. So among the bad news, and this is too bad, right? If you look China as being taken as a competitor, obviously that's a lot better. Now, what about the other side? So let me give you a couple of very interesting survey on China by the Chinese newspaper media, the Global Times. Some of you may know who this paper is, which is very much official, but is very populist and nationalist kind of media. But it did a survey, which when I read the result, I actually thought it was quite reflective of the current sort of feelings or the reaction, opinions of Chinese regarding United States and US-China relations. So some are surprised, some are not surprising. For example, the US-China relations still regarded as the most important by far than the other international relations. So still Chinese regard this relationship as very important. That's a somewhat a surprise, but not completely. But this one is very interesting. I think should be taken very seriously. If you look at when they ask whether this new Cold War between China and the US is likely, and 23.7%, roughly 24% total see not likely or less likely, but you see so many, about 40% think it is very likely or inevitable, or it began. This is actually the language were quite strong in that sense, right? So, and also the second charts, and on this slides also say, do you agree China's strength versus United States competition has grown significantly? That is very important change, say, from several number of years ago, right? We don't have a more recent survey because this is down very regularly like Pew in the United States. So this is a rare window through which we're looking into this sort of a Chinese, a public kind of opinion of China, how they regard themselves. So self-confidence has risen quite dramatically. And that, a lot of people feel China in this competition, China at least that, predominantly feel that is in a stronger position, if you will. Now, this chart also is very important, I think, for us to understand, for you to know, is that when it asks where a new Biden administration ease tension in China-US relations, but it's a mixed opinion, right? Some say yes, some say no, some say don't know. So a lot of people still don't know whether it would increase. And then you have this very last question was quite interesting. This is from the survey, and the survey asks about whether the wolf warrior, this kind of a tough, hawkish diplomacy posture by China is, how they agree with that. 71% say this is the diplomatic attitude should take, 71%. So that's obviously give you a sense of how China today is, a lot of Chinese, public opinion. And I think it's really, to some extent, even though it's done by Chinese media, it does reflect what a lot of Chinese Chinese people regarding their relationship with the United States and themselves. So let me finally say that, so this indicates that Biden administration has a short-term and long-term challenge. Short-term challenge is how to disentangle and this really massive relationship right now. We're in a stalemate. Even after the Anchorage meeting by the foreign ministers, and it seems that there's no concrete move by neither side to sort of thaw this current frozen stage of relationship. And a number of things that the Biden administration probably, or with China together, could do. For example, visa, now is a practical frozen of visa. There's international travel as the pandemic situation improves. And also, there are a number of other things that probably Biden administration could do in short term. But long term, let me end with this note. In long term, I see a lot of very challenging for Biden administration, and that is how to gain the trust and respect of Chinese, because this is a very challenging, and how to really also lead the, sort of facing the domestic pressure, the public opinion on the United States, to improve the relationship with China. And that's, I think, is very challenging. And I'll end it there, in here and turn to Eugenia.
Thank you so much, Xiaobo. Our fourth speaker is Andrew Nathan. Andy.
Hi, I'm thrilled to see my colleagues. I haven't seen them in over a year, and I'm very happy to be meeting this way with the alumni. I'm going to present a sort of guardedly pessimistic view of the relationship. The US-China relationship, I think, changed in a fundamental way under Trump, from one that looked for cooperation and was optimistic to one that was antagonistic. There were some political causes for this, particularly some of the members of the Trump administration. I'll give the example of Mike Pompeo, wanted to demonize China for their domestic political aspirations, but the real causes were much deeper, and those are structural. They are the change in the power balance between China and the United States, the rise of China. And as China has risen and is richer and can invest in more military capabilities and diplomatic capabilities, it has wanted to improve its security situation. And the United States has, for a long time, been the chief threat to Chinese security. So China wants to improve its situation, and the United States feels threatened by that. Even so, the change from Trump to Biden has brought in some big shifts in American policy. First of all, the Biden administration's policy is already much more strategic. Trump's administration was divided, and Trump himself had no long-term strategic vision. Biden's administration is going to be disciplined, and as Tom said, has experts making policy, and they think strategically. And the first element of that strategy is to restore America's relationships with its allies, and to try to develop a common approach, not to destroying China or to containing China, but to try to shape, to borrow the title of Tom Christensen's recent book, Shape Chinese Behavior, A second element of the Biden strategy is rebuilding the United States, because at the core of this strategic competition between China and the United States is the power balance, and the United States has been declining in power, declining in will, declining in political determination and clarity, declining in soft power. And so we really can't compete effectively with China without rebuilding those things. A fourth element of the Biden policy is going to be a consistent emphasis on human rights. And I think there are three reasons for that. One is an actual commitment on the part of the members of the administration to the integrity of the international human rights norms. But a second one is political, which is to frame the US-China competition as a clash of systems. As Biden said recently, we have to show whether democracy works or authoritarianism works. And that means not only with respect to how individuals are treated, but that the two economic models are seen as, one is rule of law, one is not. The military strategy, one is seen as obeying international law, and the other one is not. So framing the competition in these principled terms to explain to the public, this again is a theme of an earlier book of Tom Christensen, to explain to the American public why we're engaged in something that's, 10,000 miles away, Asia. You have to say, well, it's all about the clash of systems. And the third reason for emphasizing human rights is that it's perceived as a weak point of China in the competition because of their violations of human rights in so many ways. And then the final aspect, I think, of the Biden policy that's different from the Trump policy would be to hope to be able to find some areas of cooperation, as all of the three speakers before me have mentioned. In this context of competition and as Xiaobo showed, rising antagonism against China, it's important to understand the quote unquote China threat as accurately as we can. How big is this threat? I think it's definitely quite serious, particularly around Taiwan, where China has very strong resolution and good reasons why they want to exert control over Taiwan. And the United States has very strong reasons why it wants to continue to insist on what US policy calls peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, which looks like means permanent separation of Taiwan from mainland China. I think the competition over this issue is going to be continuous and very, very intense. And there is the risk of military clash emerging out of that competition, and the implications of the competition over Taiwan for the US position in Asia, the power balance in Asia, Japan, Korea, the Southeast Asian countries are very important. The other very, very real part of the so-called China threat is who's going to dominate the 21st century economy, because that will decide which economy grows faster and has more access and sets standards and so forth. On the other hand, I think we shouldn't think of the US-China competition as an existential threat to, American autonomy or our control over our own system. China is not a revolutionary power. It doesn't have an ideological ambition to impose Chinese style rule over the whole world. It's not the Soviet Union. The confrontation between the two sides in a military sense is at sea, in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the Western Pacific, not on land as it was in the old Cold War. And as Qin Gao and others have said, unlike the old Cold War, there really is a cooperation imperative for things like global public health, for things like climate change and other issues, North Korea, Iran, as Qin Gao said, education, social welfare, poverty elimination, and so forth. However, and this would be my final point, that although there is a cooperation imperative, at the level of the ivory tower or the 30,000 feet level, we can see this imperative, but when one begins to dig into the modalities of cooperation, the devil is in the details, and it quickly turns out that within cooperation, there is still competition. So to take the example of climate change, there is the question of which country will dominate the new technologies that are necessary to alleviate climate change. Who's going to control solar panels? Who's going to control hydrogen, not batteries, but hydrogen power systems? Who's going to control these technologies, because that country will benefit. So, and who will invest how much in alleviating climate change? And in every area of competition, of cooperation, you have these elements of competition. And a final obstacle to competition is distrust. I think Qin Gao mentioned it, or Xiaobo mentioned it, but the trouble about mutual distrust is that it is well-founded. It isn't something you could just wish away. China, for example, has violated their WTO commitments. The United States, for example, has violated its commitment to the Iran nuclear deal and so forth. In fact, the two countries realistically cannot entirely trust each other. And so it's not something that we can fix by just saying we need to trust each other. International politics is very cruel, and it's really founded on mistrust. And so it's not going to be easy to find a way forward toward the cooperation that we all need. Thank you very much. And back to Eugenia.
Thank you, Andy. Our last speaker is Professor Ben Liebman. Ben.
Great. Thanks for having me. Good morning or good evening, everyone. It's great to see such a great turnout. So I guess one of the benefits of going last is I just get to say I agree. So maybe I'll just try and highlight a few issues that haven't come up or developed them a little bit more. But I generally agree with the tone of this conversation so far. You know, I like to say I think the Biden administration is going to be smarter, not softer, much more emphasis on alliances, but I don't expect, you know, major changes with regard to China. I also think it's important to emphasize, I mean, we frame this discussion as US-China relations under Biden, which I think implies that, you know, improving relations somehow falls more on the Washington side of things than on the Beijing side of things. And I just think it's important to recognize that this really stark deterioration we've seen in the last few years has roots both in Washington and in Beijing. There have been big political changes in both countries over the last 4 to 8 or 9 years. And those have together contributed to the downturn in relations. So looking forward, also, you know, we need to look at how things are changing both in Washington and in Beijing as we think about how at least to stabilize, if not improve, the relationship, which is another way of saying that any shifts need to be reciprocal, right? Both in substance and in tone. There needs to be some interest on both sides in having a more stable relationship. And I'll say, you know, I guess I'd say we're only 3 months in. There are some sort of smaller things I would have liked to see happen, but I was sort of watching to see, are we going to see some positive steps early on, especially coming out of the Anchorage meetings. I had hoped there might be a few more positive steps. I think there are things that both sides could do to sort of show goodwill. On the US side, I think clearly ending the travel ban, in particular on Chinese students, would be an important step in terms of building goodwill. I don't think there's a public health justification right now for the travel ban on China, given the low COVID rates in China and the openness of the US to travel from many other countries where things are much worse. On the Chinese side, I think it's clear, right, that the major step China could take would be a sign of goodwill would be to free the 2 Canadian Michaels, including Columbia graduate Michael Kovrig, who's now been imprisoned for more than 2 years. But the signs aren't good, right? The fact that we haven't seen progress in either of those issues, I don't think is not a great sign in my view. I really had hoped we'd see some progress on this. All right, so in just the last couple of minutes, I guess what I want to do is highlight a few issues that maybe we haven't touched on too much yet. Maybe one we have, a couple we haven't. One is I think it's really important to and interesting and worrisome to watch the sort of escalating cycle of sanctions. I call this the sort of reciprocal lawfare that we're now seeing. The cycle of sanctions and counter sanctions from the US, Europe as well, our allies, and from China. Also much more assertive use by China to use its legal system to target critics outside of China, including academics. I think this is a new and worrying trend. And I'll say, I don't actually think that all of the US sanctions have been particularly productive or helpful. You know, the recent sanctions against senior National People's Congress officials, including a lot of legal folks, I don't quite understand what they were trying to achieve. And then we've seen the response from China of sanctioning academics, think tanks around the world. I just think this is something to watch, and it's gonna, you know, if this continues, things are gonna probably continue to get worse rather than getting better. I think it is worth noting that the US at least believes that it is sanctioning conduct while China is sanctioning speech. But I think this is just an important issue to watch, and it's something that's developed pretty rapidly over the last year or so. Second, I just want to say a word about travel and visas. Obviously, we all here at Columbia hope that travel can resume, in particular, so that many of our students now in China can return. I guess, you know, I don't have any great inside information, but you know, my best guess is that nothing is going to change anytime soon. And that's because I think almost certainly any resumption of travel is going to be through reciprocal agreement, right? The US is going to have to lift its travel ban on China, but China's going to have to also start letting non-Chinese nationals in with some greater degree of ease than exists right now. And I just don't see that happening within the next few months, and probably not happening even, I wonder if it'll even happen before the Olympics, given concerns within China and also vaccine rates within China heading up to the Olympics. And then on cooperation, you know, I agree with everything that's been said that we need to find areas of cooperation, climate change, public health, you know, related issues. It's worrying to me to watch the sort of reciprocal questioning of vaccines that's happened on both sides, spreading of disinformation in some cases about vaccines outside of China. You know, I think it's clear, I'm sure most people on this call would agree, you know, the world needs all of the vaccines to work, Chinese vaccines, the American vaccines, whatever, German vaccines. And just the fact that we're still locked in this cycle of mutual questioning about things so fundamental as vaccines is I don't think it's good for anyone. So, you know, my hope is that there can be ways in which, you know, the if not government, at least you know, academia, medical science can strengthen ties and cooperation at this incredibly vital moment. And I'll just close by saying, I think, you know, what does this all mean for us at Columbia? I think in a time of really worsening US-China relations, the need for engagement by universities remains extremely strong, right? That we need to be having the conversations on a range of issues that maybe, you know, folks in Washington and Beijing are finding it harder to have. So you know, I think all of us look forward to opportunities to engage with our Chinese colleagues more going forward, and to having students back and travel going on. I think this is going to get only more important going forward. I also just want to say that we're really fortunate at Columbia to have a really outstanding team at the Global Center in Beijing, and they've just done an extraordinary job over the past year of keeping events going out of the center in Beijing at a time in which, you know, none of us can travel to China, and folks from China can't travel here. So I just want to say thank you to them, and you know, we look forward to more events working with them over the coming period, and hopefully to doing some of these events in person as well. So I'm all set.
Thank you, Ben. I think at this point, I might raise a few questions to generate a little bit of a discussion among panelists, and hopefully for the next 15 or 20 minutes. And then I will open up to a live Q&A session. We're already getting a whole host of questions in the Q&A box. So thank you all. Many of you shared, I think, a view, I think Andy put it, sort of guarded pessimism, although we all want to remain hopeful. about the current relations. And I wanted to perhaps just start with Ben's point that perhaps the university is in a good position, given the fact that politicians are in this ever kind of, war of escalation, kind of constant back and forth. The Anchorage meeting was certainly one where it was a bit dismaying, no indication that there was going to be an immediate improvement or thaw in terms of the relationships that some had hoped would be the case with the new Biden administration. And then, of course, on the ground in the United States, there is growing anti-Asian violence and fomented initially from some of the sort of aggressive stances taken by those who were in power originally due to the COVID situation, but that are kind of also had long been brewing because of the structural, right? Andy talked about, these are relationships. The tensions have been brewing beyond just the Trump administration's more, anti-China stance. So the question is, how do we be hopeful and how do we go forward? And many of you have suggested certain ways. Ben's point about academia being a possible place for collaboration is one that is, and especially as we are all part of the university, is one that is perhaps a sensible one. But at the same time, Ben, your presentation is one that suggests that there's still serious obstacles, right? I mean, the visa ban. I mean, one way that we collaborate so deeply is by bringing students over here and by having our students and faculty go to China and working with Chinese colleagues. Qin Gao was talking about all these possible points of soft diplomacy. But when you have these literal obstacles, such as the ban on travel and the targeting of academics, both by the Chinese government, but I will say also our own government, right? One of the things that we've been witnessing on campus is Chinese scientists, not just on our campus actually, but MIT and so on and so forth, being targeted for purported espionage, right? So any how do we, even in this kind of more sort of focused space, which might seem a little bit more hopeful than the political arena, where both governments are dealing with escalating internal and domestic pressure, as Xiaobo was pointing to in China, but many of you have also pointed to the public pressure from the US. Any thoughts about, whether there, even within this kind of contained space, how can, sort of soft diplomacy, academic cultural exchange, any sense that there is a change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration? Does anyone want to take a stab at that question?
Thank you for the question. I can just quickly say two things that the Biden administration is doing that's positive. One is rolling out the vaccines very, very fast, very effective. I think that will show the Chinese don't be so afraid. I mean, that's related to the travel ban. I think from the Chinese side, they are really afraid of new cases coming in. So I think the vaccination rollout in the US is doing well. Of course, more needs to be done. Secondly, given the recent anti-Asian rise in the anti-Asian hate and assaults, it's a tragic thing that's happened, but I think it awakened people, and the Biden administration has acted quickly and will do more. I think that's also moving in a good direction. Thanks.
Ben talks about the sort of reciprocal kind of tit for tat sanction. And this is something I was thinking about it, that even the pandemic made this kind of a reciprocal or tit for tat, kind of a posture that much more often, and that much more, even, between EU and China too. EU was ready to open because EU opened travel last fall to South Korea, where, pandemic situation is relatively, about the same as China. Even China, in a way, in some ways, is better, but not China, because on the ground of China will not, in short term, reciprocally do the same thing. So it now makes this kind of an entanglement that much harder. That US, for example, could have opened China, a while back. Yet, as Qin said, that because China itself now worry about the imported infections, And as long as China, United States in situation or pandemic's not, getting better, or and not, at least they perceive not that better, then they would not. So that makes this kind of travel ban that much of a harder to disentangle, because that reciprocal kind of become more and more like a practice.
Maybe, can I
Yes,
just
Ben,
jump in
go
for a
ahead,
second? Let me just say so Eugene, I think you raised extremely important issues, and on the sort of U.S. targeting of Chinese scientists, suspicion of folks who have ties to China. My hope is that the Justice Department, now under professional leadership, will take a more sensible approach. Although I think it's important to recognize that concerns in the national security establishment about China run very deep. So I don't think we know yet enough to, I don't think the FBI's China initiative was helpful. I think it was way over encompassing. I think, so the hope is we can get a little more nuanced approach. I also want to say that part of the problem I think we had, and we have a system of sort of politicized U.S. attorneys, and clearly some of them were using their positions as U.S. attorneys to do some high-profile prosecutions and prosecuting first and thinking later, I think, in some cases. But I think we're going to see a smarter approach, although I don't think it's going to go away. And I think there really are very deep concerns. And so, I think it remains to be seen exactly how this plays out. But some of the rhetoric maybe will change. And I think the changes of the rhetoric at the top make a difference, right? What we're seeing now is obviously there's nothing, unfortunately, right? Institutionalized anti-Asian racism runs very deep in the United States, almost as deep as this country. Much of this backed up by the force of law over much of our history, and it's a very shameful history for the United States. So what we're seeing now, I think is reflects that history, but also reflects the really explicit racism we saw coming out of the Trump administration. And I do think that different messaging at the top, will over time have a difference, although we're obviously always paying the price for what's gone on over the last 4 years, but also what's been going on over the last 200 years, in recent attacks here in New York and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Eugenia.
Yes, Andy, go ahead.
I think that educational cooperation and so forth is very important, but I don't want to leave the impression that these issues are easy to resolve. The technical competition for the leading technologies of the 21st century economy is real. Chinese acquisition of technology from the United States and Europe through methods that are legal and some that are illegal is a real problem. The universities are a place where some of that technology gets developed. And so I agree with Ben that it has to be handled, professionally, but it has to be handled. And then I think another issue that is difficult is Chinese attempts to influence scholarship. We must preserve academic freedom on our campuses if this educational exchange is to have any value. So I'm all in favor of it, but the problems that are inherent in it are also there.
My next question shifts us to the issue that came up with Tom's initial comments, but was a recurrent theme in many of your comments, which is the focus that the Biden administration now is shifting towards, that the Trump administration did not pursue, but basically this focus on alliance, using our sort of ability to ally with other partners in the world in order to sometimes contain, sometimes enable cooperation, sometimes to manage the competition with China, and ideally, hopefully, with an eye towards reducing the tensions, even recognizing the realities of a rising China and a declining U.S. Right, the U.S. empire, as Andy put it, is one of the reasons why there is this sense of threat. But I wanted to ask you all, perhaps Andy and Tom, but others as well. The U.S. Under Trump had also really sacrificed its relationships with its allies. So what sense do you have? I mean, we have to mend bridges and mend fences with a lot of people. So if the U.S. re-enters a lot of these pre-existing sort of multi-alliance kind of organizations, will we do so as in a position of strength that we once had? If not, will the Biden administration be willing to kind of be more co-equals with other allies, whether in Asia or in the US? Any thoughts on this matter?
Tom, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks, Eugenia. I think it's pretty easy to improve US relations with allies around the world and partners. There's a lot of partners. By most measures, the United States has 60 plus allies and partners around the world. China really has very few, North Korea being one formal one, maybe Pakistan, and a few rogue states around the world. And then some people think Russia. I don't think the Russia-China relationship is really an alliance, but it is a close relationship. So the US has an enormous advantage in that realm. The Trump administration did a lot of damage to the US alliance system by putting trade pressure on allies like South Korea and Japan and on the EU states, and also very publicly calling them out for not burden sharing enough, sharing the burden enough in the alliance. So that should be relatively easy to fix, but I think a lot of American allies and partners can't really unsee the Trump administration phenomenon. So I think it's going to be hard to build deep trust for the US commitment to allies in a hurry. And they have to worry about 2024. Who will another Trump administration equivalent come into power then? So I think some damage has been done, but I think it's an easy thing to improve, not an easy thing to fully restore. And then the multilateral organizations, the Trump administration, pulled out of lots of them, did tremendous damage to the WTO. I mean, the U.S. is a much bigger violator of the WTO than China is at present, with the trade war, and also the Trump administration went after the adjudicating judges in the WTO system, preventing them from being hired, so that you couldn't even, the WTO became somewhat paralyzed. So going back into those organizations should be relatively easy. Going into discussions on climate change should be relatively easy. But again, I think the US lost a lot of credibility by pulling out of all of these things. And I think Iran is going to be very, very difficult. And I really don't like it when Iranian diplomats look sensible compared to the American position. But their argument that the US pulled out of the deal unilaterally and should return to it unilaterally is going to find a lot of followers around the world, particularly in Beijing. So it's going to be very difficult for the US to get leverage on Iran since the US unilaterally pulled out of a deal that a previous administration made. And one of the alums has asked a question about whether the focus on domestic politics in the United States will prevent the United States from engaging China in a serious way. And I think if you mean big meetings between US and China, the strategic and economic dialogue type meetings that happened in previous administrations, I would say yes. But there are pressing issues out there that really matter to the United States and to its allies, like climate change and like nuclear proliferation, that will not allow the United States to avoid dealing with China. The world is still there. The world creates pressing matters that we have to deal with Beijing on. And those are already happening on Iran. And I think they'll happen with climate change. And it's just the reality of the international system that countries can't, in a globalized system, can't afford to just pull into themselves and say, we're just going to concentrate on our own issues.
Tom has an important article that says a lot about this question of American relations with its allies on China policy. And is it the next issue of Foreign Affairs, Tom? Or
No, it's out. It's the online edition. So it's March 24th. It's out. And I make an argument that our allies are our greatest strength, but our allies don't want a Cold War with China. So,
yeah. And so one of the important points that Tom makes in this article that he hasn't made in his brief presentation here is that none of our allies' interests align 100% with our interests. The European allies' interest in China is predominantly commercial. They don't have a major security commitment in the Western Pacific, South China Sea. They have some. South Korea and Japan don't want don't want a Cold War with China because China's too close, too big, too dangerous, too important. India doesn't want to align itself with the United States completely. It wants a little cooperation and not too much. Even Taiwan, is, depends entirely on the United States, but doesn't want the United States to sort of pull down the house around the ears of Taiwan. And so if you're going to cooperate with the allies, and I think this is the main point in Tom's paper, that constitutes a kind of constraint on what US-China policy can be, probably a beneficial constraint.
Yeah, you might call it adult supervision, Andy.
Yeah.
Great, thank you both. One final question before we turn on the live Q&A or move to the live Q&A. I wanted to ask a little bit about the China side of affairs. Xiaobo was shared with us very helpful charts and graphs, giving us a sense of some of the sensibility of the Chinese citizens in terms of where they see themselves in the world today. But I wanted to get a more forensic analysis insofar as trying to understand, the Chinese population obviously knows that Biden is not the same as Trump and that the new administration is coming in. Do we have a sense, does this panel have a sense of whether the Chinese internal discussion is acknowledging and recognizing that shift and has a pulse on the US domestic, both governmental policy and Biden's approach versus also, as well as the kind of domestic popular sentiment in the US vis-a-vis China. And also, do we have any sense that Xi Jinping's policies are shifting in response to the new Biden administration? What kind of footing? I mean, obviously the Anchorage one suggests continuity, but I was wondering if we could get kind of a more subtle analysis perhaps, or any observations on this front. And any thoughts? Maybe Chin and Xiaobo might start us off.
Let me just look at try to answer the first question. I don't know what Xi Jinping's policy and so on, but at the people's level, how the sort of Chinese, sentiment, I think, is evolved and changed over the last 4 or 5 years. I think in part, one of the big damages, if you will, that the Trump administration in terms of this US-China relations is this kind of how Chinese view the United States. I think Biden is completely right that, again, overall, not just the US-China relations, but overall, the damage that's done by previous administration is that the kind of a trust, the kind of a democracy as it is understood by the Chinese, or at least some of the aspirations among some Chinese, younger generation, middle-aged people who are, who come of age in the 1980s, 90s, now looking at United States in a very different, kind of used different lenses, different kind of because in part because the disinformation, I have to say that with the internet, with the irony is that Trump administration tried to ban WeChat, but WeChat actually is the one I see that among all the social media spread the most disinformation about United States, really, for better or worse, because a lot of those disinformation people, a different generation, because older Chinese also use WeChat, right? I mean, then say Weibo and others. And so they actually got all the information and they believe those information, and they actually sometimes forward to those of us living in the world and say, oh, this is true. So they got a lot of that. And that's irony because social media became a venue like elsewhere in the world, but China too, is that the disinformation, the image of the United States has been damaged. And along with it is democracy. So that's why a lot of Chinese now feel more self-confident. Even after the pandemic, they feel, see, the Chinese way is better. Again, that's how I think the subtle but significant change among the Chinese public opinion regarding this United States and U.S.-China relations. I think that is maybe add to that pessimistic view of Andy and others have. It's in the long term, that one is hard, very difficult to change, to reverse.
Thank you. I would just add, as Andy mentioned, one of the foci of the Biden administration has been to rebuild the US. I think that's really a great new focus. It's not that foreign relations, international relations are not important, but some agenda items can be pursued quietly. But in the Chinese people's eyes, the US has been in decline, both in rhetoric and in the economy, in human relations, infighting between, racism, all these attacks. That's very disheartening to the American people, but to the world. So the Chinese people could just be shocked and laugh at the US and worry about their relatives and friends in the US, including all of us. So I think for the Chinese people, what they have enjoyed in the past decades is a rebuilding of their country, poverty eradication. Now they've shifted to revitalize the countryside. Again, huge investments and expansion in social welfare policies to the most impoverished. One of our current research projects is to look at how the Chinese government at the central and local levels to bring clean water to every corner of the country. That's amazing for the Chinese people. So I think if they see a shift in this focus in the US, I think that's comforting, and that's a good direction for everyone so that there could be more dialogue. Right now, I think the Biden administration is moving in that direction, and it's very good for both the American and Chinese people. But I think that could be emphasized more and pursued more. And I think that would do Biden well in the upcoming elections.
Thank you, Chin. Yeah, no, your point about kind of the overlap in terms of their approaches toward infrastructure, I thought was a very interesting one, and coincides with what many other panelists have also discussed in terms of these opportunities of collaboration, such as climate change. But we should add to those, issues, the infrastructure issue too. Let's move to the live Q&A, and I will just call some questions. Some overlap, and I will pose them for the panelists. Some maybe, I think we can have one or two panelists address them. I might identify some that speak more to, a particular panelist's expertise, or else I might keep it open and see who might be interested in speaking. So one question that came in from the alumni, Martin Leung writes, what can we expect the US strategy to be with Taiwan, Hong Kong? And how big of an effect will this be on US-China relations? Would there be anyone, Tom, maybe I'll have you start off with that.
Yeah, this was my area of responsibility at the State Department. So I guess I have to give an answer. It's difficult to predict how it will play out over time with the Biden administration because it's so new, but they seem to be continuing with their desire to upgrade various contacts with Taiwan in a way that is upsetting to the mainland. Recently, a US ambassador to Palau accompanied Palau's president to visit Taiwan. That would be unprecedented in the post-1979 era in my recollection. I don't know whether that was thought through, whether that was strategic, but those types of contacts are a source of aggravation to the mainland, and that affects US-China relations. I expect a strong commitment from the people I described before, like Dan Crittenbrink or Rosenberger, Kurt Campbell, for Taiwan security. And I agree with Andy that this is going to be probably the main point of tension between the United States and China in the security realm. But I think it's very different from Hong Kong. And I think the United States has a lot of options with Taiwan. It doesn't have a lot of options with Hong Kong. And I think what you've seen with the Biden administration is a continuation of previous policy, which is a basic recognition that Hong Kong is no longer what it used to be. because of the national security law and the interference of the mainland in Hong Kong domestic politics and government. Hong Kong is no longer autonomous from the mainland. So it will be treated as non-autonomous in US foreign policy. Hong Kong was treated differently in trade, economics, visas, all sorts of things from the mainland in the past because it was autonomous. Now it's not considered autonomous. I think that's justified. And that's pretty much the extent of it. You have these sanctions on individual officials who deal with Hong Kong. I think that's kind of feckless. I agree with Ben on this. We're dealing with a Leninist system. It's very hierarchical. The idea that you would sanction an individual colonel, general, one-star general in a system like that because of the policies suggests that those individuals have some leeway for decision. And I don't really think they do. I don't think the policies on Hong Kong out of Beijing are determined by some foreign ministry person who happens to be seconded to Beijing's representative office in Hong Kong at any given time, or some state council official. Those are made at a very high level. So I don't see the point in sanctioning the individuals. And I think it's very destructive that China has reciprocated, particularly in the EU sanctions against think tanks and other things. So I don't see much progress on Hong Kong. I find it very depressing. And I don't think that US policy will really change from what it is now and what it was last year, which is to treat Hong Kong as basically part of the PRC from here on out.
Okay, thanks, Tom. We have several other questions, so maybe what I'll do is move on to another question here. Right here, I have one question from an anonymous attendee. And perhaps this one might be directed towards Andy. Recently, Beijing released a report of US violations of human rights and emphasized the strategy of telling bad US stories to its domestic and international audience. How will negative reports and mutual distrust in the public realm influence both countries' public opinions and in turn influence US-China public strategies?
As you know, the Congress many years ago, decades ago, passed a law that required the Department of State of the US to issue an annual report on human rights in other countries. And so China's included in that, and other US government agencies like the Congressional Executive Commission on China also issue reports on Chinese human rights. And the reports published by the United States about Chinese human rights are very accurate. And China has responded by, and this isn't the first time, by publishing reports on human rights problems in the United States that are also very accurate. There is a lot of bad stuff to be said about human rights in the United States, different issues from the Chinese issues, but bad issues, especially around racism and poverty. So it's a tit for tat. I mean, one optimistic take on this is that the Chinese seem to be affirming the validity of human rights discourse among states, which in fact is legal under international human rights law, but that's not really, and they seem to trust US media because their sourcing is entirely to US media, but that's not really the point. The point is you spit in my eye, I'll spit in your eye. On the questioner's question about the impact of these things on public opinion in either country, I think not much. I think this is a little game of the diplomats, and I don't think the general public pays a huge amount of attention to the reports. I don't think, for example, that Chinese people's, I would defer to Xiaobo, but I don't think that Chinese people's image of the United States is quite depending on what the Chinese Foreign Ministry report says. And in the United States, I think, although there's, as Xiaobo pointed out, a lot of hostility to China on human rights issues, it's not coming from the State Department, it's from the media, it's from the politicians and so forth. So the reports themselves probably are not a big factor.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is mostly it's coming from the kind of the coverage. In fact, one could see in the last few years, the coverage of United States or the Western countries, the kind of official media's tone has changed, evolved into much more picking, all right, if you talk about human rights, let's talk about, Black Lives Matters and, racial and poverty and all that. Indeed, that's the kind of the highlights, it's all, I will say, it's not necessarily fake news, but it's a selective reporting, right? It's selective reporting, which exists in all countries, but the Chinese official media, obviously, that's where the kind of image of the public opinion is being formed. I think that is a crucial, source of the, information that people in China sort of, get that what's going on in the United States.
If I may add here, in my view, I think the Chinese government released reports have a bigger influence on Chinese people's views toward the US than the US government release of the reports. I don't think in the US, a lot of people pay attention to it or read it at all. I mean, the public opinion, as Xiaobo said, is more influenced by the media. But in China, the foreign ministry and those public events where they share the reports do influence people a lot. I worry a bit about that. If that's the rhetoric that's being highlighted, even though it's true, it could influence public opinion and indirectly the relations between the two countries.
Thank you. I'm actually bundling two questions, and perhaps I will actually ask Ben to start us off with addressing these two questions. They're both related to university, sort of the educational world and how it's entangled in US-China relations. So one, Alfred's High writes, how do you view American antagonism towards the political agenda of Confucius institutes in the United States? And then the other one was, I think might have just lost it. It was regarding the issue of Fulbright.
Yep, I got it. I remember. I read it.
Okay, you remember it? Okay, so sorry, I'm losing it as I scroll through.
So let me start with the second one first. I think folks on the call will know that the Trump administration ended Fulbrights for China. I think this is terrible, and certainly hope that Fulbrights will be reinstated under the Biden administration, right? I mean, especially at this moment when it's becoming harder for folks to travel and US-China relations are deteriorating, we need more knowledge about China. So I think, we should have Fulbrights back in China. I think it's absolutely vital for our own national security, for our own understanding of China. I think it's good to have Americans teaching in China as well. There's research, there's teaching. So now I don't know whether China's going to let the Fulbrights back in. It's another question, actually, given the change. I think that might prove to be a bigger obstacle than the termination. On the first side, I just think the days of Confucius Institutes are rapidly ending. And, I just think this is probably going to be something that we see in the rearview mirror. It's many universities have closed their Confucius Institutes. My guess is ones that haven't will be doing it soon. At some level, I mean, I think this reflects geopolitical changes, but I also think it reflects the way they were run. If the record over the last 15 or 20 years had been of zero interference and total openness to debate, maybe the situation would be different. But there's enough evidence from around the world that hasn't been the case. But I just think that this is rapidly, I personally think we should be encouraged, we should be spending US government money to fund language programs. I mean, our response to Confucius Institutes should not be to shut down language programs, it should be to fund language programs. And so, my hope going forward is that we can see reinvestment in study of Chinese. It's in our own interest to do that. But I do not think I think the days of Confucius Institutes on American campuses are rapidly approaching their end. But I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that.
We're speaking of rapidly coming to an end, I think our session is rapidly coming to an end. I think I have time for one more quick question. And so anyone can feel free to jump in and share their brief thoughts on this. So one question was, how will Biden's policies shift if he loses 2022 midterm elections, or if he wins? Any thoughts on this? It's a tough question. It's asking you all to look into the future.
I think Qingdao has the lead on this, because the thing that'll affect the most is things like domestic infrastructure projects. On China policy, there's a pretty broad bipartisan consensus for a tough posture towards China. So even if he holds on to a slim majority on Capitol Hill, I don't think that that's going to have a huge impact on China policy versus having the Republicans having a slight majority. But on things that involve large amounts of spending, domestic spending, I think it'll have an enormous impact. So I'll just defer to Chin, what she thinks about the infrastructure programs in a situation in which the Democrats don't have a majority.
That's tough. I hope the Democrats come to their senses in supporting this. But I agree, Biden is correct to focus on rebuilding the US, including investing in children, education, technology. Maybe some of that requires a different narrative. So call it infrastructure, call it something else. But I hope he would retain the majority so that a lot more can be done. I mean, to turn the US back to this very positive path requires a lot, including the legislative power. So I'm only hoping it could get there. And I hope the people give the politicians enough pressure for them to do the right thing.
Thank you all. I think our time is coming to an end. I want to thank my esteemed colleagues for their insights, very important insights during a tense moment. Hopefully it's a pivotal moment. We are all, as again, Andy mentioned, guardedly pessimistic. I hope we can eventually turn to being guardedly optimistic. And I also wanted to thank all the attendees for joining us in this important conversation. And again, to the CAA Global Clubs for organizing a fascinating and compelling webinar. Thank you all.
Thanks, Eugenia.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.